Hello everybody, I'm back today to talk about another piece of my presidential memorabilia collection. This is a really cool piece. It's this signed photo of Gerald Ford with former Texas Rangers owner Amon Carter. A little background about the photo: this was taken on opening day 1976. The Rangers were playing the Minnesota Twins and the Rangers won. And of course, Ford was there to throw out the first pitch. I also wanted to use this as an opportunity to talk about Ford as both a president and a person. And I really do find Ford fascinating because at face, he's just an ordinary man, very plain spoken, very homespun. And people think he's just this ordinary man put in extraordinary circumstances, and as a result, he's a bit of a caretaker president. But the more I've read about him over the years, the more I've realized he actually really truly is an extraordinary individual. Now, what makes Ford interesting in so many ways is that even putting aside his presidency and putting aside his political career, prior to that, he had a very successful life in sports of all places. He did play football at Michigan. He won 2 national championships, was a team MVP, and even upon leaving college, he had 2 professional offers from the Green Bay Packers and Detroit Lions. But instead of taking those offers, he opts to go to law school and then goes on to have a pretty successful career as a lawyer before entering politics in 1948 as a congressman. This 1948 class ends up being very influential and powerful in due time. Because you've got Gerald Ford, but you've got John F. Kennedy as well. And then, of course, you've got Richard Nixon. And even on the Senate side, you've got Lyndon Johnson. It's at this point, though, you can't really tell the story of Gerald Ford without also telling the story of Richard Nixon. The two enter politics at the same time. They end up being very intertwined. With Nixon, he has this very quick meteoric rise. He's in the House, then he's suddenly in the Senate, and before you know it, he's the Vice President of the United States. And then, of course, Nixon goes on in 1960 to lose to the eventual president, John F. Kennedy, and then he has some wilderness years, but then he goes on to become president in 1968. And then meanwhile, you've got Ford on the House side, and he goes on to have a respectable career of 24 years in the House, but he also ends up being semi-anonymous until 1973. Because in 1972, Richard Nixon and Vice President Spiro Agnew are re-elected in a blowout fashion, but in 1973, a scandal comes to light involving Agnew that is involving bribery and kickbacks from his time as Maryland governor, and as a result, Agnew is forced to resign. So Nixon calls upon his old friend Gerald Ford, who he's known since 1948, and asks him to serve as vice president. And of course, given Ford's strong reputation as a man of character and good standing, he gets confirmed by the Senate with relative ease, and he goes on to serve as Nixon's vice president for a very brief period of time because in 1974, Nixon himself is forced to resign following the Watergate scandal. So all of a sudden, you have this man who wasn't elected vice president, wasn't elected in any sense. He goes from being vice president to president in the span of about a year. Now, Ford's presidency doesn't actually end up being all that long because he only ends up serving out the remainder of Nixon's term. And this is because in 1976, when he tried to get elected in his own right, he was pretty soundly rejected. And one of the largest reasons he wasn't reelected, or elected rather, is because of an action he takes in 1974. And it ends up being a very unpopular, controversial action. But it's his decision to pardon his predecessor, Richard Nixon. Now, had Ford not pardoned Nixon, in all likelihood he would have been convicted. He could have potentially done prison time. But Ford realizes that this would be bad for the country, so he sacrifices his own political career and chooses to pardon his predecessor because he believes it's ultimately the good thing for the country. In his eyes, even though it's not the popular decision, it's the right decision. Because when you're president, decisions you make may ultimately not be popular, but in the long run, they may be the correct decision, and that's how Ford views it. But of course, this does cost him his chance to be elected in his own right, and he gets defeated by Jimmy Carter in 1976. And now, to be fair, it also simply wasn't Ford's pardoning of Nixon that cost him the election. There was also rampant inflation at the time. There was the fall of Saigon. But what Ford does during his presidency, outside of pardoning Nixon, that's consequential, is he implements whip inflation now. And it does manifest results, but it's too late to save his political career, and he still ends up losing to Carter. Now, the good thing for Ford is he lives long enough to see his reputation get rehabilitated because of the decision to pardon Nixon. Because at the time, once again, it was very unpopular. But as the years go by, people come to understand his intention in doing so and realize that it ultimately was the right decision. And since then, historians have really vindicated him in that respect. If you do want to learn more about Ford, I can strongly recommend his 1979 autobiography, A Time to Heal. It's a very insightful look into his life, and it's a very enjoyable read as well.